Hello, I'm Amy, and this video is part of my Reknit Revolution project. I'm going to show you how to open a row, pick up the stitches and knit into them. In this case it's the second step of the replace cuff process, as shown here, but you'd also use the same technique when altering a section within a garment, like this. And the advice here includes how to change gauge from lots of fine stitches, as shown here, to fewer, chunkier stitches here. And just a reminder that although this process is called replace cuff, it also applies to replacing the hem or any edge section of a knitted garment. In a previous video I showed you how to unpick the seams of a garment to allow you to get to a flat piece of fabric, so then you'd have something like this. In principle this might be a bit tidier than what you would get to if you were unpicking a garment, but two selvages, something that's not unravelling at this point. You need to be sure about where you want your opening to be, so whether you want the transition between the old section and the new that you're going to add on. Stitch a marker thread to kind of test that out and try your garment on so you're absolutely sure where you want that to appear. So I've stitched my marker thread on here to show the rows I want to open. So I'm ready to open it now. I'm going to cut a stitch at the centre, around the centre, it doesn't need to be exact at all. I'm going to cut half a stitch like that, and then I can take this thread out now, get it out of the way, and use a blunt knitter's needle just to tease that thread through every half stitch one at a time. And you just want to make sure that you are tugging in the right place and not the row below or the row above. If you think if you're opening like a letterbox, it should always be the short side of the letterbox that you're pulling at. So once you're recognising it, you'll be able to work your way along reasonably quickly. Might be a bit slower if the fabric's matted or worn. Okay, getting close to the edge. So you just need to be a bit careful at the edges. It becomes harder to see what you should be undoing. There we are, that's kind of helping me. Okay, so that's those two, and then I can do the same again going the other way. And as you can see, although I've exposed all these open stitches, the fabric isn't just instantly disintegrating. They're generally, unless you've got a very slippy yarn or a complex structure, if you're just working with stocking stitch and something reasonably kind of sticky like this, those stitches won't really go anywhere unless you wave it around a lot. So at this stage I'm okay. Just be careful with that last bit. Okay, so there we are. I've got my two separate sections. So now I need to put these stitches onto a needle, and so in principle if this was a sleeve I would remove this bit, this worn cuff section, and this would be the bits I want to knit down off, so let's treat it like that. I'm going to turn it around, ready to pick up. So you're going to use a needle that's nice and fine and can slip into those stitches really easily without stretching them, because if you stretch them they might start to unravel a bit, so use something really definitely a bit finer than you would normally knit that gauge with. And before you start picking up, think about which side of the knitting you want to start, which side of the fabric you want to start knitting on. So I want to start knitting on the knit side, and there's some patterns for working a transition here on the website that specify whether you should be starting on the right side or on the wrong side that you might want to use. I'm going to do the one that tells me to start on the right side, so I want to start off knitting like that. So I'm going to keep the fabric this way around. Okay, so I'm going to put the loops on the needle, and I want those loops to be sitting the right way round, as if I'd just knitted that row. And in order to do that, if I go from left to right, working this way, and if I pick up the loops, putting my needle in from front to back, they'll work out correctly. So I can just slip them in like that. As you can see, I'm handling it. The stitches aren't unravelling or going anywhere. It's all going fine. Don't panic if one does start to run. You can always kind of pick up the ones on each side and then ladder it back up with a crochet hook. Okay. An alternative would be, if you were finding it was unravelling a bit, you could, I'll just show you with the needle for a second. Just pull that out, bear with me. You might choose to pick up those couple. You could sort of, let me just move that. Pick up the stitch from sort of the row below. So if you could unravel a row, can you see? So there's the first stitch. If I pick up the one below it, it's a bit like undoing, I suppose. Then the yarn from this row is holding the row below safe. So you might find that to be a useful alternative. In some cases, if you're having trouble, just going into that top row of stitches. Okay. So going back to this one, so you'd now be ready to knit, and if you're knitting at the same gauge as the existing fabric, then that's pretty straightforward, and you'd be able to go straight to the right size needle, which would be this one for this fabric. So I can knit from this slightly finer one onto this one on the first row, and off I go. If you are working with a finer fabric, or you want to go from finer to chunkier, things are a little bit more complicated. So I've got a sample here to show you, which is with much finer fabric, and I've picked up the stitches. I'll just do the last few to show you. So you can see I'm using a much finer needle, but the process is exactly the same, and although it is a bit fiddly, it's really not that bad. So it's just looking a bit funny at this side. Let's just sort that out. Okay, something like that. Okay, so here's my fine knit. I've shown you that it's possible to pick up those stitches, but now I would need to change gauge from this fine fabric that's finer than I want to hand knit to something that's a more standard hand knit gauge, and there are instructions to help you kind of figure this out on the Replace Cuff page on the Reknit Revolution website. So I'll show you the chart and just quickly talk you through it. So here's the chart, hopefully we can see that. So this fabric, this old one, has, I counted the stitches in 10 centimetres across the knit, and that figure was 36. So that firmly puts this fabric in the mid-industrial category here, the orange one. So that's fine, and I want to hand knit, so I want to use this chart to see the options of what I could convert it to. So if I follow these orange arrows, it shows me what I could do. I could knit at a ratio of 4:3 and change it to 4-ply. I could knit at a ratio of 3:2 and change it to double knitting, or I could knit at a ratio of 2:1 and change it to Aran. Okay, so I've chosen to go to double knit weight using a ratio of 3:2. I did a sample using the suggested needle, so I used a 3.75mm needle, so I wanted a new stitch count of 24 because I could see that was 2/3 of the original 36, so I was getting it kind of exactly right. And so I knitted a little sample to check that I was coming out at the right gauge. So that's where I got up to. To do the transition between these gauges, I need to work a transition pattern, and there are two options on the website. Basically, those patterns guide you through the decreasing that's needed to get from this to this. Okay, so follow the patterns that are on the website. My main tip would be that you need to work up gradually through the needle sizes. So on my first row, if I was doing this decreasing, I might work to this is a 2.25mm needle. I might then work up to one that was a little bit chunkier, and then get to the size that I'm going to end up at. Okay, so it's kind of working up through those needles gradually over potentially 3 or even 4 rows. Will just ease the change from those very fine stitches to the ones that you're going to knit. And so after that, once you're knitting away, you've worked your decreases and you're knitting up here, just remember on your new section to do any shaping that's needed. So if you are replacing a cuff, you'll probably need to do some decreases. And when you get to the end, do a loose cast off, as you would do with any top-down knitting, as otherwise you might find that your cuffs are too tight. Okay, so here I've talked you through picking up stitches from an open row and what you need to think about when knitting off them. And the next video will show you how to sew up the seams to finish off your replacement cuff. Thank you.